This is session 5B, Pensions and Longevity Risk. I'm Steve Siegel. I'm a practice research actuary on staff at the SOA, and it's great to be here for another session. I was just moderating our previous session. I see a lot of you have stayed for this session also, so very pleased to have it. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started. Before I do that, one housekeeping item. If you want EA credit for this session, there's forms in the back. Please fill them out and then bring them up after the session. I'll collect them and turn them in. And so, okay, now on with our session. Our first speaker is Laurie Curtis. Laurie is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Waterloo. In addition to academic positions she's held, she's worked in the healthcare industry and at Health Canada, where she ran a research group. She specializes in issues impacting women and children and has recently been examining the issues for women as they move into retirement. She's going to be speaking on her paper on how amending old age security would improve the state of Canadian women living alone in retirement, and she co-authored that with Doug Andrews. Our next speaker is John Forman. John is the Kenneth E. McAfee Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Oklahoma. He teaches there courses on tax and pension law. He's lectured around the world and served on numerous federal and state advisory committees. He has more than 300 publications, including Making America Work, which was published by the Urban Institute Press. John's going to be speaking on his paper, Fully Funded Pensions for Centenarians. And then finally, our discussant is Rob Brown. Rob's a retired professor from the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at the University of Waterloo. During that time, he wrote 7 books and more than 50 refereed papers. He's been president of the CIA, SOA, and IAA, and has focused his research on the design of financial security programs during times of rapidly shifting demographics. Okay, so we'll get started. Laurie, please.
Okay. So, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to attend the sessions. And if I can figure out how to get this going. There we go. Okay, so this is part of, as if you were here in the last session, Doug presented another part of this paper, and we are part of a much larger research group that Doug put our organizations up. We thank now I'm an economist, so all these acronyms don't come off the tip of my tongue, but the SOA, the CIA, I like that one, the CIA and the IAA, sorry, IOF? IFO, as well as the Kent University and University of Waterloo, SHRC, and some other organizations that have helped us we've been going 5 or 6 years now, for a while. So, and because I teach writing to students and they're getting horrific at citations and referencing, I always put, the references are all in the paper. So we're talking about Canadians. This paper started out, our hypothesis would be mainly about women, but as you will see in the research, we ended up including both males and females, because even though women outnumber men substantially in retirement, there are some men that are in very poor circumstances. So, as we all know, well, Canadians and people in other countries are living substantially longer. We're not increasing the years of work on average, and so we need to be resourcing longer retirements with a stable working life. We've been looking at particularly the late stage of retirement, but in the literature they do recognize 3 stages of retirement. So early, 65 to 74, the middle, 75 to 84, and then the late retirement stage. Okay. And retirement resources follow a U-shape. So they're high in the early stage where, the seniors are young. My grandson wouldn't say that, but young, you're active, you're traveling, you're socializing, You're getting out there and doing all the things you were too busy to do when you were working. They're lower, the financial needs are lower in the middle stage. When you're at home, you're retiring, you're working your garden, you're doing your home routines, you're living a quieter life. And then in most countries go up again in the late stage of retirement when health diminishes and you need more help or assistance with daily activities and health care. Okay. So we are looking at what we call the alone stage of retirement. So women tend to live longer than men. If they marry, they tend to marry older men. Many female baby boomers, and we have looked at the baby boomer population in specific in another project. Many that sort of after the 60s, the sexual revolution, many baby boomers didn't marry. If they married, they divorced. Some women tended not to have children. So a growing proportion of Canadian women in particular will be alone at the end of the middle and into the late stage of retirement, where they may have limited incomes and they may have limited social support. So this is what we're looking at, the alone stage of retirement. Okay. So from our literature review, those over the age of 90 is a growing age group in Canada as in other countries. In 2015, we had about 8,100 centurions, and I don't know how many people know a lot about Canada, but we're about 10% of the population of the U.S., even though we have a huge landmass. So that 8,100 is projected to double by about 2031. There are equal numbers of men and women, pretty much, in the earlier groups of or earlier ages of retirement, and then women gradually outnumber men as you go into the older age groups. So about 62% of those between the ages of 85 and 89 are women, and that's about 88 to 89% of those over 100. So women's longer life expectancy leads to this gender gap, okay? But men are catching up. So in Canada, probably 3 decades ago, we had a problem with senior poverty. The government put in substantial policies to reduce that poverty rates of seniors, but in the last couple of years, the poverty rate is going up for seniors again. So particularly senior women, the poverty rates increased by 3.2%, and for those in a family, they increased by 3.2%, but they've gone up almost 20% for women living alone. Similar changes, again, were found for senior men, but there's many fewer senior men living alone, and I'll show you that in the data. So the poverty rate for Canadian women living alone is 28%, compared to about 11% for all seniors. Okay, and separated and divorced women face even higher poverty rates. Okay. Separation and divorce, in another paper we did, separation and divorce actually lead to larger negative effects on women's income replacement than does widowhood. And although women are more concerned about financial security and running out of assets, they are less knowledgeable about financial planning and long-term care planning. So this study, we are examining the level of expenditures needed to meet basic standard of living measured we have the Canadian government market basket measure. So unlike the U.S., Canada did not have a poverty measure. We had several measures of low income. I'm going to say 2 summers ago, the government came out with the official measure, and it's this market basket measure. And the basket includes necessities such as food, clothing, footwear, transportation, shelter, and some other basics, costs of living, which this basket is measured by Statistics Canada and a couple other government agencies get together. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the basket measure and we're going to compare this to the income available to Canadian seniors living in the alone stage of retirement. And those incomes include private pensions, Canadian pension plan. So if you worked in Canada, you can get the Canadian pension plan. We have old age security, guaranteed income supplement, and other income support programs. So we look at all income available to seniors, and we compare that to the market basket measure to look at those living in poverty and the poverty gap. And we look at how much we would have to increase the seniors' incomes to get them out of poverty. Before the market basket measure, internationally, most researchers will look at what we call low-income measure, or a measure of income poverty that is basically half the median income adjusted for household size. So because we're only looking at household sizes of 1, we don't need to adjust it, but we will do some comparisons so that the paper could be looked at both in Canada and internationally. Okay. So the data, in Canada, it's more difficult to get data than it is in the US. We applied to use the Canadian Census non-public data. Actually, I got permission to use it last week. So we've done this study on the public use data, which amalgamates and aggregates groups. So when we can go and use the private data, I don't expect the results to be a lot different, but there may be some minor differences. Okay. So the census is the census is collected in Canada every 5 years. Sorry, Q5 comes from my nursing background. That means every 5 years. The long form survey, which is completed by about 25% of Canadians, is what we're using. And it just has information on, as well, income, age, relationships in the household, taxes, etc. So the data we need. The income in the data are from tax files, so they are reliable, and they don't suffer from the issues that survey data for income do. Okay, we look at those living in the 10 provinces. There is information on those living in the territories, but the samples are quite small. So, and we tend not to use them for that reason. Okay. So the poverty indicators in the data, as I said, are the relative after-tax measures, LIM, and the market basket. Okay, we use that to calculate the proportion of seniors living in poverty. The poverty cutoffs, the actual values of them, were not available in the data, and that's part of the issue with using the public versus the private data. So I actually estimated them best I could using other tables from Statistics Canada, and I had to aggregate some of the geographic areas. I did it using population-weighted averages. So the data will be more exact when I can use the privately held census data. Okay. So as I said, the income we're using is income from all sources. When the government puts out the market basket measure, they use disposable income, which excludes expenditures on non-insured but medically prescribed health-related expenses, such as dental, vision care, prescription drugs, and aids for persons with disabilities. So most people are quite alarmed with this, but in Canada, because we have public health insurance and we have additional assistance at the provincial level for most seniors, this only would only change the income on about 7% of our seniors. So it's not a huge issue, and again, when I get the private data, I should be able to adjust for this. So basically, it's a fairly descriptive paper. We calculate the poverty gap. We look at the individual's total income. We look at the poverty cutoff. subtract those to get the poverty gap. And then we look at how much income the senior would need to be moved out of poverty. And we look at how much it would basically cost for the government to increase the old age security to meet that. Okay. So income for seniors over 65 is employment income if you're still employed. Canada Pension Plan, if you've contributed through employment, that's a federal program. Old age security is a federal program. Guaranteed income supplement to the OAS, which is given if your income is below a certain threshold, again, federal. People have private pensions related to their employment or and private savings, both on the personal side. And then some provinces offer additional benefits. More and more, they used to be based on age, but more and more they're becoming income tested. So those can, like in Ontario, where I'm from, Ontario Works, an Ontario Disability Program, which in the U.S. would be considered welfare, basically. There's also Ontario Guaranteed Income Supplement. Again, if your income doesn't come up to a certain level, it will top it up. Okay, and so the data includes all of these sources, okay, and is tax after tax. So how many seniors in Canada? So these are the weighted numbers from the census. And so when you can see there, when you're in the 65 to 69 age group, the males and females numbers are quite close. About 1 million females and just over 900,000 males. And as you go through the different 5 age bands, the number of females outweighs the number of males substantially. By the time you get to over 85, you've got about just under 200,000 males and over 300,000 females. So that was all seniors. If you look at the number of seniors living alone, the picture is much more drastic. So you've got about 240,000, or almost, well, a little over 240,000 women living alone in the early age groups compared to 150,000 men. And when you get up to the over 85 or the later stages of retirement, you've got about 50,000 men and 3 times as many women. Okay, so substantially more women living alone at the older ages of retirement. Okay. If you look at our poverty measures, the proportion of Canadian alone seniors living in poverty by the 2 different measures. So on your left is the sort of international poverty measure, the what we call in Canada the after-tax limb, and then our Canadian official poverty measure, the market basket. You can see the proportions of individuals living in poverty at the different age groups. And we were quite surprised by the fact that, by the MBM, I'm going to call it, by the MBM, males in the 65 to 69-year age group, the proportion of males living in poverty is actually higher than the proportion of females, but that drops quite drastically as you move into the older age groups. So you've got about 25 to 30% of the population of seniors that live alone living in poverty by the MBM measure, substantially less than the international standard measure that typically is used, where the proportions are closer to 35%. So we move into our stages of retirement. We've got early, middle, and late, as I said, and you can see the limb and the market basket shows slightly different trends. For the females, the limb shows an increasing poverty rates from about 35 to 40% over the stages, For males, it's dropping from about 35 to 25 over the stages of retirement if you look at the limb. And for the MBM, both, the trend is falling in both groups. So when we measured the poverty gap, by the limb, the poverty gaps are between $230, $40 per month up to about $350 per month. Slightly less when you're looking at the market basket measure, okay, but there still is a substantial monthly gap in income for those living in poverty. Okay. We did an analysis. We looked at different, how much it would take to move the average individual, on average, individuals out of poverty. If you we're looking at increasing the old age security payments to move on average, everyone out of poverty, a supplement of about $290 per month would be needed. And that would, as you see from the two middle chart, the two middle groups in the chart, move most poverty rates up to close to zero. If we added a supplement of $217, that moves almost everyone out of poverty, but not quite. So there's the figures there. Okay. So what would it cost? In the 2016 census, approximately 4.8 million Canadians received Old Age Security or the Guaranteed Income Supplement in 2015. About 380,000 of those had incomes below the market basket measure poverty line. So if we supplemented $290 a month to all OAS recipients going in line with guaranteed income measures, that would cost the government about $16.7 billion a year. If, however, we paid only recipients living in poverty that $290 a month, that would cost the federal government $1.17 billion a year. And there's a whole literature looking at why we would do a guaranteed income supplement for all versus a income-tested supplement. If we reduce that to $217 a month, that would move most people out of poverty. The cost reduced to $12.5 billion and $875 million for all or poor recipients of OAS, respectively. So in perspective, the government spent $48 billion on elderly benefits and $22 million on children's benefits in 2016. So to increase everyone's OAS would be about a third of that, and it would, to increase only those living in poverty would be a marginal increase in the benefits. Okay. And the Canadian GDP is about $2.24 trillion, so particularly helping poor senior citizens or poor seniors living alone would be only increase GDP marginally. So, oops. Okay. So, some caveats. When we did the analysis in Canada, when you receive the guaranteed income supplement, it is clawed, or those who receive the guaranteed income supplement, it is clawed back as your income increases. Because we didn't know the exact values, again, because of the public release data of GIS and OAS values, we couldn't adjust for the clawbacks. So these costs are probably on the higher end if we could adjust for the clawbacks for particularly when you're paying guaranteed income across the population, the cost would have been lower. So we believe that particularly for those living in poverty, the cost of the program are marginal, and even running a guaranteed income program, paying all seniors an additional amount is viable. Thank you. And then there's our partners and our research team. Thank you.
This? Yeah, okay. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for inviting me as well. This is a great opportunity for me to share some of the research that I'm doing on funding of pensions, and I share Lori's concern about the adequate pension income that people are going to need in old age, particularly if they live past 85 or so, and was not thrilled to hear my prospects as a male of making it to over 100 didn't sound terribly good. Also, my wife is typically younger than me, so she's certainly going to outlive me and probably by a bunch of years. I have some hopes that as we subject women to equality in the workforce, that their lives will become as hard as the men's lives before them. We'll see. But I do think there's a convergence in life expectancies of men and women, and there's more, perhaps, convergence of marital ages as well. But poverty in old age is a big problem, and adequate incomes in old age is a big problem. If nothing else, this is the most important slide because now you know where Oklahoma is, the red speck over there. Okay, oftentimes financial planners say that you should shoot for replacing 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. There's lots of different measures of how you might do that, but that's a typical kind of approach. And Social Security replaces around 35% of the typical worker's income in the United States. As we'll see later, or in the paper at least, more for low-income workers, less for high-income workers. It's moderately progressive because it turns out that high-income workers like me and my wife are more likely to be married than low-income families. And not only that, we're likely to live longer than low-income families. So the progressivity of Social Security turns out to be, I think, relatively minimal, and it's something we have to think about. But at least if you are old and poor, you're getting an inflation-adjusted Social Security benefit for the rest of your life, and that's very, very important. But on top of that, what I wanted to look at was how pensions could pick up the balance and whether pensions do. I do a lot of research on funded and underfunded pensions. State and local government pensions are underfunded. The multi-employer pensions, the federal level, Teamsters, things like that, they're underfunded. Many private companies' pensions are underfunded and have gone out of business. But we do want to think about having enough saved for retirement. And now we're moving to this defined contribution world where each of us has to save on our own. So the question is, how much to save? Nevertheless, I use a defined benefit model. I create two models, one for a defined benefit plan and one for a defined contribution plan as models of saving enough to balance out Social Security so that you could have 75% of your pre-retirement earnings inflation adjusted for the rest of your life. No matter how long you live, and even if you lived past 100, you'd still have enough. So this paper looks at what it would take, how much you have to save to get there. And of course, there's a lot of approximations, and you may or may not like all the assumptions, but I've made a number of assumptions to make it understandable to most people. And for me, I wanted to learn a lot about what actuaries know about, which is how to accumulate benefits and then how to fund those benefits. That's what I looked at. But first off, again, a 65-year-old man in the United States can expect to live to be 84. A 65-year-old woman can expect to live to be about 86.6. And a 65-year-old couple, there's a 50% chance that at least one will live 27 years to age 92. Again, it's certainly going to be my wife, more likely than me. A 25% chance that one of us will live to be 96. And a 10% chance that at least one of us will live 35 years to be age 100. Now, this presents the largest problem facing the changing population and demographics, and that is, and I particularly pick on police and fire because and military because they often think, I worked 20 years, I got a pension for the rest of my life. No. You can't start working at age 20 as a cop and work till you're 40 and then expect to get free health care and a free pension for the rest of your life when you're quite possibly going to live to be 80 or 90. So if you work 20 years, you can't afford a 60-year retirement. If you work 40 years, maybe you can afford a 30 or 40-year retirement or a 20-year retirement on average. But we have to keep those things in mind as we think about funding pensions and or Social Security. Obviously, we could solve the problems with Social Security or in the United States with an SSI program that makes sure that the elderly are never poor. And I think that's a good idea in the United States. But I looked at specifically, what if, in addition to Social Security, all you could have was what you saved in a pension? That is, let's ignore your house. And for most people, they have no stocks and bonds or other assets. So it's really only they have their house, they have Social Security. How much do they need to save in a pension to replace another 40% of their income so that 35% from Social Security and 40% from a pension? What would it take to get there? So I created a model defined benefit plan first. And again, I know these are they're uncommon now. I still have one with the state of Oklahoma, a teacher's retirement system, but most private sector workers no longer have defined benefit plans. They're still a good idea. Why? Because they pay out in terms of lifetime annuities, unlike defined contribution plans where a typical worker reaches age 65 and says, gee, I can draw, or 62, I can draw Social Security, and I've got $150,000 in my 401k plan, and I've always wanted a new truck, so I'm going to go out and spend $50,000 on a new truck, and then I'll have $100,000. I've never seen that much money at the same time before, and I'll be able to live great in retirement. And they retire at 62, and they have $100,000 to live on for the rest of their lives, which is going to give them about, $6,000 a year of annuity for the rest of their lives, plus Social Security. Not adequate. You need a lot more than that. But ideally, everybody would have a defined benefit plan, and we could design a universal pension system that paid out in the form of a defined benefit plan, or a universal pension system that was a defined contribution plan, which paid out, if not all, a significant share of its money in the form of an annuity. So we could get there either way. But it's nice to model a defined benefit plan. Now, the model I chose is a little bit odd in some fashions, but I do think people want to save on every job they have. Now, not many people are going to work for one employer for 40 years, but my model suggests that we can design a pension that will replace 40% of our pre-retirement income by saving by earning a pension of 1% times years of service times final average pay and working for 40 years. So if you work from age 25 to age 60 through age 64, then at age 65, you would have 40 years of service. And if you earned 1% of final average pay or final pay at that point in time, you'd have 40% of your pre-retirement earnings for the rest of your life. Then I worked from there and I said, well, let's make it understandable. So let's start with final pay. And let's use final pay instead of final average pay because mathematically it's simpler if it's slightly more generous. And let's start with a final pay that makes sense. Like, okay, when you reach age 65, your final pay at 64 was $100,000 a year. And starting at age 65, you want to get $40,000 a year for the rest of your life, 40% of a $100,000 final salary. And then I backed up from that with a variety of assumptions to figure out what your starting wage was and how it would grow. Here are some assumptions in this model, the defined benefit plan model, but also the same assumptions are going to apply to a defined contribution plan. The question is, ultimately, how much do you need to save every year for 40 years of a career in order to get $40,000 a year when your final pay is $100,000 a year? And the answer is at least 7.27%. More if you want an inflation-adjusted pension. But if you saved 7.5% every year that you worked from age 25 through age 64, you could fund a pension that would replace 40% of your pre-retirement earnings. How do I get there? I started with a higher interest rate, and last year the S&P 500 made 28%. But on average, I think we can only realistically assume that investments will earn 5%. In the future. That's what most analysts are telling us. I realize lots of state and local pensions still have 7% assumptions about what their future incomes are going to be. Most of them are underfunded, and many of them have met that 7% target. But most financial analysts and advisors don't think that you can count on 7% income in the future. So I backed down the model to 5%, which is more realistic. What's the inflation rate? Social Security system and others suggest around 2.5% a year is the best estimate of what inflation will be from now into forever. Salary growth rate, and again, following Social Security numbers, how much have wages gone up per year on average? 3.5%. Now, my son's wages go up quite a bit because he's young and he's getting a lot of promotions, and later in his career, probably not so much. But on average, 3.5% a year is a reasonable assumption. When do people start working? Well, they start working before 25, of course, many of us. I was a caddy on a golf course when I was 17. Now, there wasn't any Social Security withheld on that, but, I had income, and I'm working past 65 already, so that's also extra years. But a typical worker probably is going to get into a pension-type saving situation, or should, starting at age 25. Better start saving something every year from age 25 on. You're out of school and you're making some money, and you ought to start saving some. When are you going to retire? 65. And again, I think we need to think about having people work longer, but not everybody can work longer, and 65 is still higher than the average retirement age today. Many people retire before they plan to. Career length then, 40 years. Age at death, this is on average, would be 85. I showed you those numbers already. Some will live to 100, but many will die in their 70s and 60 and early 80s and so on. So the length of retirement on average, 20 years. Longevity at entry age, that is when you're 25, how long can you expect to live? Till 85. Now, here I've made an assumption that should just be noted, and that is, I assume everybody age 25 actually works 40 years and actually lives in retirement for 20 years. And that's not realistic, because 15% of you 25-year-olds out there, I don't see a lot, but 15% of you are not going to make it to 65, okay? So 85% of people do make it from 25 to 65, and then on average a 20-year life expectancy thereafter. And again, I assumed final salary of $100,000, final pay, benefits based on final pay, that is just the final year, $100,000, rather than, say, the final 3 years, which might have been a slightly lower number. Benefit accrual rate, 1% a year. Vesting period, everybody vests all the time immediately. You start work, you earn a benefit, and it stays in your account, which is what we hope, and certainly what we hope for IRAs and defined contribution plans. The benefits paid out in the form of a single life annuity. In the discussion section, I talk about qualified joint and survivor annuities, etc. I assumed an annuity factor of 10. 12 or 13 might be more realistic, but 10 is mathematically an easy number. If you want to have a $40,000 a year pension starting at retirement, then you need to have $400,000 saved by the time you're age 65. Check your bank accounts and see how close you're getting. Okay. With that background, here's sort of what happens to our hypothetical typical worker who's going to have 35% replaced from Social Security, and then also going to have a salary that increases over time and a pension that grows over time. On this model, the pension is going to accrue at the rate of 1% times years of service times final average pay. And going back here, so you see years of service, down 64. At age 64, you see the final salary is $100,000. Years of service, 40. The benefit factor, 40% of final pay. gives you a pension starting at age 65 of $40,000 a year. What's the value of that pension? $400,000. But it is a backloaded pension. If you look at the column on annual benefit accrual, you see that benefits accrue very slowly in defined benefit plans, and only towards the end of life, as you get closer to retirement, does that pension get very valuable. They're backloaded, which is why they get underfunded, particularly with employers with an aging workforce. Benefit accrual in the last column, as a percentage of current year salary, grows from hardly anything when you're 25 and you're working in a defined benefit plan to 40% of your pay when you're 64. You're earning $100,000 that year, but your pension's going up by about $40,000 that year. And here's how it looks. 3 different lines, really. The middle line is the one that's salary. You start with a salary. I backed up 3.5% pay increases every year for 39 years, so that at age 25, your starting salary was $26,141, and it grew at 3.5% a year to $100,000 at age 64, so that you can get that pension at age 65. The value of your pension on the top line grows from 0 at 25, you've got no pension, and it grows up to be worth $400,000 at the when you're 65 years old, when you turn 65. And it grows, the accrued benefit grows rather quickly. This chart shows it a little better. The annual benefit accrual percentage starts quite low, but grows as you get closer to retirement. It grows to be a much more significant share of your pension, which is why employers want to get rid of you, because you're getting expensive, and every year you keep working, you get expensive. And they have to pay for your health care as well, and that's more expensive for somebody old than somebody young, which is why old people don't get to work easily. So we could do some things to change that, and universal health care might be one. So there's a lot of ways of funding, and I have a much longer article that goes into various ways of funding private pensions. But here I just want to suggest that one approach is to use the entry age normal cost method, a level percentage of salary method. So we're going to look at what you make every year and figure that out. What percentage of salary every year that you work would be enough to get us to $400,000 by the time you're age 65. And an actuarial computation, given all the assumptions in the model, suggests that if every year from age 25 through 64, you save 7.27% of your salary, you'd have $400,000. This worker would have $400,000 at age 65, with a last year at age 64 of $100,000 of salary. And that would be enough to pay a $40,000 a year pension for the rest of this person's life. And by the same token, that's also true for a model defined contribution plan. So having developed a model defined benefit plan, a final average pay plan, if you will, the model defined contribution plan makes all the same assumptions. Says, well, gee, yeah, let's assume you can have the same interest rate, the same pay raise rate, and so on. But now you're going to have to do it on your own in an IRA or a defined contribution plan. What do you need to do? Again, if all the assumptions are the same, and they won't always be, because some of these are heroic now, the interest rate, individuals can't invest as well as defined benefit pension plans. And individuals can't buy annuities at as favorable of a rate as a defined benefit pension plan that covers lots of workers. A group annuity is cheaper than an individual annuity. But if we ignore that for the moment, if you, from age 25, or if you're telling your kids, I've got 20s kids, and I tell them, save, save, save. And if they save 7.27% of salary every year from age 25, then when they reach age 65, they'll be able to have $400,000, they'll be able to retire, and they should be in pretty good shape. Now, because the assumptions aren't quite accurate here, probably they need to save more. But a defined contribution plan could replace 40% of pre-retirement earnings just as well as a defined benefit plan, and particularly if we imposed a condition of some kind of mandatory annuitization, or at least partial mandatory annuitization. So that's sort of what the model does to articulate all these issues. And then I looked at questions like, well, why isn't the real world like that? And the real world isn't like that because not everybody works 40 years. Not everybody works 40 years, and let alone 40 years for the same employer. So many people work less than 40 years, sadly, I suppose. I've worked more than 40 years already, and I'm still working. If you work till age 70, then you can save less each year. If you only work to age 62, you probably have to save more each year. If you don't vest in a particular employer, then you're not going to get any benefits from the 3 years you worked, or the 2 years that you worked with that employer, and your 401k contributions didn't ever vest. The employer's contributions never vested. So that would be unfortunate. And then you better, if you're going to change jobs a lot, you probably need to save more with each employer that you do save for retirement for. Then in the real world, not only that, employers underfund their pensions and go out of business, and so benefits that were promised to you don't get to you. And also, well, if you worked for the state of Oklahoma for 40 years, you'd certainly have a nice pension out of the state of Oklahoma. But if you only are a school teacher for 25 years, then you didn't earn the full pension, and you're not going to replace 40% of your pre-retirement earnings with your pension because you changed to a different job or you left the workforce. You took care of relatives and children, you have less earnings, and so on. But again, you need a model to start with. How much do you basically need to save? Another question is inflation and COLAs, particularly for the elderly population that we're concerned with. And so inflation in the real world, this chart really shows us, I think, what's most critical for the super elderly, those who are older. If, what I've suggested is if you saved 7.5% per year, you'd have enough for $40,000 a year for the rest of your life. That's your nominal pension in column 2 here. In column 3, I assume that inflation continues. Just because you're retired doesn't mean inflation stops. No, it continues. Social Security provides you an inflation-adjusted pension, but typical pensions don't. And you need more. And if you look at column 4 here, the real value of a $40,000 a year pension, yes, it's worth $40,000 at 65, and you thought it was great, I can afford to retire. But if you live to be 80, the buying power is only $27,619 on this model with 2.5% inflation. If you live to 100, your $40,000 a year pension's only buying $16,000 a year. And as we saw with the U-shaped curve of spending that Lori mentioned, you probably need a lot more money then because you need care. You need people taking care of you. You're not traveling, you're not vacationing, but you've got health care needs and in-home needs. And if you do live to 110, somebody just made it to 117. If you do live to 110, it's only worth $13,000. So how much do you really need? That is, if you wanted to have $40,000 a year pension for the rest of your life in inflation-adjusted dollars, the last column suggests that you should increase, the pension should increase from $40,000 at age 65 to $94,000 at 100, and $121,000 if you happen to live to 110. And what would it take to do that? Again, you have to save more. I just used a rough estimate and said, well, if on average people live 20 years, how much more do you need to hit all the targets of saving $40,000 the first year on up to, $55,000, $60,000 by the time you're 85? You need 23% more. So if $400,000 was what would get you $40,000 a year, then you need $523,000 by age 65 in order to have an inflation-adjusted pension for the rest of your life. And that means you better save 9% of salary, not 7.27% of your salary every year for the 40 years that you worked, if you were lucky enough to do that. Now, of course, thank you. Of course, in terms of working careers, very few people work 40 years. Men, on average, in the United States, from Social Security studies, have about 39 years when they qualify for Social Security benefits, but women, on average, have 29 years. Again, I think that's going to change, and people are working longer, but basically, it's not that common for people to work 40 years, let alone to accrue a pension benefit or pension savings of any kind in every single one of those 40 years. They don't vest in their benefits and so on. So probably most of us need to save more more than 9% to have that inflation-adjusted pension for the rest of our lives. And a few of us are going to be lucky. I mean, I've worked longer than I expected. My wife and I saved for our kids' college in case if I'd gotten disabled or she had gotten disabled, we still wanted our kids to go to college. Then they got to college. We didn't have to save for college anymore. Then we got healthy and old enough and we didn't have to save for retirement anymore. So life's pretty good if everything works your way like it has for my wife and I. But for a lot of people, you're disabled in your 50s, you've lost your job at 61, you're eating your savings before you get to Social Security and so on. So I didn't talk about spousal issues, but of course we could design the system to be a joint and survivor annuities and take care of both husbands and wives and so on. In terms of variability in economic and demographic variables, I hope that others can use my model and just say, well, no, wait, I think we're going to actually earn 6% on all of our investments, and therefore you could use this model and determine that you didn't need to save quite as much. You could decide the inflation rate was going to be different, or the salaries aren't going to go up as fast as I suggested, 3.5% a year on average. Or there's just variability, right? I assumed constant inflation, constant 5% returns. If you get 3% returns one year and 7% returns the next year, you don't average out at 5% returns. And the order in which the returns come can make a difference too. But this is a very simple model. Finally, I guess I guess I would just say, look, if we care about retirement income security, we want to do things like beef up SSI so that it provides minimum income for all the elderly. I'm not averse to negative income tax that would provide adequate income for all Americans and even Canadians. I include in that broad notion of Americans. So Social Security could be beefed up and could be more generous. It could be kick in more generous at age 85. If you live to age 85, you get more generous. But we need to think about fully funding pensions for all workers. The easiest way to do that would be with add-on Social Security accounts. So if not mandatory, then at least voluntary. Every worker who who is not otherwise covered by a pension should be automatically enrolled into an individual retirement account, an individual retirement savings account that could be administered through their employer and then through the Social Security Administration and on to something like they have in Australia, Singapore, Chile, or Israel. And again, voluntary would be good. Auto-enrollment and auto-re-enrollment. Oh, I don't want to save for retirement. I'm 28 and I'm really saving for a house. I don't want to save this year. Okay, well, next year you come back to your employer and you're automatically enrolled in the retirement savings account again. We need to get people saving more for retirement. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Okay.
Thanks to Steve. I'm still a pocket calculator kind of guy. So my duty is to keep you all awake for the next 13 minutes, and that is how I will measure my level of success. I already lost a couple. Jeez, that's not a good start. I'm going to review the papers in the reverse order to their presentation, starting with Jonathan's work, which was carefully done, well-researched and documented. I didn't check the arithmetic. I'm not really a numbers guy, but I did have some issues, and I'm hoping in bringing these forward that they're meant as much for the whole audience. So involve, participate. This idea of using the gross replacement rate is widely used, but it's used by financial planners and financial institutions. I would say that in the research literature, this is falling into disrepute. There's now a growing literature on not using the gross replacement rate, which is a comparison at a point in time in earnings levels, gross earnings. For example, Canadian actuaries Fred Batiste and Malcolm Hamilton have looked at achieving consistent consumable income over all of life. This is after tax and after all deductions. And they find a gross replacement rate of about 50% gets you constant consumable income. Now, how could it possibly be 50%? Well, there's no more deductions for Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' comp. You're no longer saving for retirement. You will have lower income taxes in a progressive tax system. Hopefully the kids are gone. I guess the royal family's having problems with this right now. I don't understand this. You know, your kids say, look, we want to move out and be financially independent, and this is a problem? And hopefully you're debt-free so that you don't have to attach to home equity. Now, one of the strongest papers on this was written by Bonnie Jean MacDonald, supported by the Society of Actuaries. And she actually did some work looking at single-point gross replacement ratios and found that those numbers do not predict living standards, continuity, and retirement very well at all. In fact, her modeling shows a correlation between a gross replacement rate and actual living standards of 0.11. Not so good. So she defines a living standards replacement rate, which is a measure of consumable income adjusted for family size. And she wants to get to a living standard replacement rate of between 80 and 120%. She says if you use what the financial advisors want you to use, then you can end up with a living standard replacement rate of greater than 120%. In fact, some 80% of people in her modeling will end up with a living standard replacement rate of greater than 120%. But the range of results is very wide, and the correlation is 0.11. So among those with a gross replacement rate of 65 to 75%, only 22.5 actually achieved a living standard replacement ratio of 80 to 120, which is her target in her modeling. Second issue is the annuity factor of 10. I realized that was done to make the arithmetic easy, but it does have some repercussions. I looked at the nonprofit pension plan for Ontario Colleges of Applied Arts and Technology. Their age 65 annuity, now this is a nonprofit, their age 65 annuity is 12.5. That does include a 5-year guarantee. The best annuity factor I could find on CanX, which is a private sector annuity quote platform, is 15.5. So what's the big deal? Well, if the factor is actually 15.5, then the contribution rate is not 7.27%, it's 11.27%. And if you do some sort of an adjustment factor to act as a proxy to cover inflation, then Jonathan's work says that's another 1.67%. So now we're up to 12.94. And I think selling the model at 12.94 is different than selling the model at 7.27. My third issue is the idea of fully pre-funding Social Security. That didn't come out as a big item in the presentation today, but it is in the paper. Jonathan's own work says this would cost $13.9 trillion. So I have to ask the question, how do you do this without imposing significant intergenerational inequities? Chile, some may say, had the solution with the bonds that were issued, but I wouldn't want to hold Chile up for retirement income security systems to anyone. And there's a couple of more questions. Where do you invest this amount of money? If you invested in U.S. government bonds, which is kind of where OASDI is now, you're still 100% pay-as-you-go. We could talk about that someday, but you're still 100% pay-as-you-go. The big question to me, though, is does pre-funding of Social Security provide greater security? And the answer is no. That may come as a surprise. But let me quote Francisco Bello, Deputy Chief Actuary of OASDI from 1988. For Social Security, you cannot accumulate assets, that is, claims from somebody else's production. If we have a large amount of money in the Social Security trust funds, we have a claim on ourselves, which does not have much meaning. The truth is, whatever is going to be consumed, be a product that you can get a physical hold of or services that are very difficult to hold, those products cannot be stockpiled. They have to be provided at the time of consumption. No matter what kind of financing we are going to have for Social Security, you will find that the benefits that will be obtained by the beneficiary in the year 2050 will have to be produced by workers in the year 2050 or just a few years earlier. Not done yet. Save the standing ovation for later. Nicholas Barr, who writes a lot about this stuff, says the widely held, bracket, but false view that funded schemes are inherently safer than pay-as-you-go is an example of the fallacy of composition. For individuals, the economic function of a pension scheme is to transfer consumption over time. But, ruling out the case where current output is stored in holes in people's gardens, this is not possible for society as a whole. The consumption of pensioners as a group is produced by the next generation of workers. From an aggregate viewpoint, the economic function of pension schemes is to divide total production between workers and pensioners. That is, to reduce the consumption of workers so that sufficient output remains for pensioners. Once this point is understood, it becomes clear why pay-as-you-go and funded schemes, which are simply ways of dividing output between workers and pensioners, should not fare very differently in the face of demographic change. So, Laurie and Doug, amending old age security to improve the state of Canadian women living in the alone stage of retirement. The paper tells you in its title and in the tone of its presentation that it's going to focus on Canadian women living in the alone stage of retirement. But the recommendations at the end of the paper apply to both males and females, since the poverty gap is very similar. As pointed out, there's this U-shaped resource need. Now, life expectancy gap between males and females is narrowing. That's a correct statement. I think overarching this, though, we need to remember that the rate of life expectancy improvement is actually slowing. So that gap may continue to narrow, but overall, the improvement levels are slowing, and that will have an impact on your modeling. So to repeat some of the statistics, the guaranteed income supplement, 72.5% of the beneficiaries are female. If it's a full GIS, then 77.8% of the recipients or beneficiaries are female. By age 80, 25% of females and 70% of males lived in couples. And these are important data because the proportion of those living alone considered low income is close to 10 times those of couples. The number of females living in poverty is close to double that of males in the early stage, triple in the middle stage, and quadruple that of males in the late stage. So that's why there is an extra interest in females, but the proposals for amendments apply equally. Because the mean gap by poverty measure, whether it's the basket or the limb, does not vary significantly by gender. So Canada has this three-legged government system of providing some retirement income security. There's the Canada-Quebec Pension Plan, earnings-related contributory. There's old age security, which is a residence-based flat-rate benefit, although it's clawed back for the filthy rich like me. And there's a guaranteed income supplement, which is means-tested and might be thought of more along the lines of a welfare scheme. Now, one of the alternatives discussed in the papers and also mentioned by Jonathan is this idea of a basic income guarantee. Recent experiments in Ontario and Finland were curtailed when a right-of-centre party was elected. The experiments were in place, they were stopped. The Canadian Parliamentary Budget Office said this would cost $23 billion. Now, Liberals, and I'm small l, Liberals, like it since it alleviates poverty and income inequality, and Conservatives, small c Conservatives, like it if it eliminates all other welfare programs. Do you know the U.S. has 126 separate welfare programs, all with different rules, all with different administration? And here's a quote I like: "The present system is not strong enough to support people, but it is strong enough to entangle people." Nixon actually tried to bring in a basic income guarantee in the 1960s, but it lost in the Senate. And Swiss voters rejected the idea of a basic income guarantee, 77% to 23% in a 2016 referendum. So it's controversial, not easy stuff. So the alternatives were a $290 increase to seniors living in poverty, which would cost $1.2 billion and would alleviate poverty even in the largest poverty gap, or a $217 increase, which would cost $875 million and would alleviate poverty in the alone stage of retirement. So the paper says to do this through old age security. Personally, I think you should be pushing it through the guaranteed income supplement system, because in the guaranteed income supplement system, you have all the checks of other income. They're already in place. All the rules are there. All the regs are there. The clawbacks are there. I would then go on to ask, should there also be an asset test? And maybe you can ask that in any of these fora. Should there be extra payments going to people who are living in homes with no mortgage, who could turn to home equity lines of credit or reverse mortgages to provide their income? Tough question. Really tough question. And finally, why the emphasis on females when your solution is non-gender specific? Going further, I don't think Ottawa wants to expand old age security. If anything, I think they'd like to see it slowly die, and it will if left alone, because the benefits increase based on inflation, whereas the tax base that provides the funding increases with the growth in the economy, and normally economic growth exceeds inflation. So that means OAS as a percentage of GDP will get smaller and smaller and smaller until it gets to the point where they can end it without losing an election. So I would strongly recommend taking it to and through the guaranteed income supplement route. But, hey, good work, good luck.
Okay, thanks to our speakers. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Please come up to the microphone and say your name and affiliation. Thanks.
I'm John Turner, Pension Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And so this is not really a question, it's a comment on Nicholas Barr's quote. And I am reluctant to say that Nicholas Barr is wrong, but it doesn't seem to me that it's correct. That GDP is, it is true that the current payments come out of current GDP, but GDP is not produced only by workers, it's also produced by capital. And so when you have a funded system, you have more investments, you have more capital, you have larger GDP, so maybe it doesn't come in all from the workers, it comes from the additional income that's produced by the capital. So as I say, Nicholas Barr is a very good economist, but it just doesn't seem like that's correct to me.
Okay, wasn't sure. Danny Garaci, I'm an actuary with the Opsi Pension Trust in Ontario. So just looking at this, Robin, you mentioned about the cost of a pension plan is 1%. So our plan is about 1.5%, and the cost of it is around 20% of pay. So around 13.5% if you were to look at a 1% plan in this case, and it's a fully indexed plan. But that's beside the point. I had a few questions for you, Laurie. I was hoping you could bring up one slide up. It's slide, I believe, 18. And it was, and you had a graph in there. And The question I had for you is when you're looking at the female and the male in the middle under the supplement of 290 over there, and what you see is that in the early stages, the bar is much higher than in the middle and the late stages. Why is that? Is the suggestion there that essentially males and females of poorer means, of lower income, in retirement will die more in the early stages, or is it something else? Or have you looked at that at all?
It's the poverty rates before the supplement are higher in the earlier stages than the late stages. So you apply the supplement and it reduces, but it sort of keeps that trend because it's a constant supplement, right?
Where it looks really interesting is in the supplement of 290, where it's showing the much lower, the poorer people essentially in retirement, where even $290 supplement, they're still in the poverty stages, and that dramatically drops after the female. Is there a correlation in this case between income they're getting prior to in retirement and mortality in this case? Is this what this is suggesting?
If I understand your question, what it's suggesting is that change my graph. The gap is we have a graph in the paper that actually shows the changing in the gap as well. So the people that are poor in those groups, the gap is substantially larger, so that when you pay 290, you're getting the people that need the 290 out, but you're leaving the proportion that are substantially poor or still in poverty, and that's the proportion that remain there. So it's how some of those people have very large gaps, and that's, I think, what that's reflecting.
Okay. All right, and then the one question I had is you've concentrated on post-retirement, essentially. You've concentrated on women poverty rates post-retirement.
Yeah.
Have you looked at their incomes prior to retirement? So of what proportion is the incomes they are having now after retirement? So what's their income replacement ratio, essentially, after retirement? If they were making, presumably these are the working poor prior to retirement?
I mean, this is all incomes. So hopefully, one of the tables sort of that we didn't show shows the different types of income. So some of them are working poor, some of them have not worked, and their incomes are OAS and GIS. So we haven't broken that out in the poverty rates. But we have another paper. I have another paper with one of the other team members, and we actually look at the baby boomers as they're moving into retirement and as they retire. And I think that paper probably looks a little bit more at the questions you're kind of mulling over. But it's been a while since we wrote it, so I can't give you any statistics right now.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Carrie Pector, Retirement Income Journal. I have a question for Jonathan and a comment, I guess, for the commentator. Jonathan, it looks like that with the passage of the Secure Act by Congress, it looks like the leading contender for a solution in the retirement security space is probably going to be a guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefit wrapped around a target date fund for defined contribution plans. And that I say it's the leading contender because that's what the insurance companies that I cover talk about offering to 401k plans. And so that's going to require something like a 50 basis point a year contribution after age 45 on 50 basis points on the balance. And then probably it could be higher in group annuities, but in individual annuities, the going payout is 5% a year. That's what the insurance companies, and then there might be volatility controls on the assets so that things don't grow too fast. But I wonder if you think that if you've looked at any of these programs, or whether you think it would be interesting to try to project, well, how much at 5% with a 50 basis point haircut, what kind of balance would you need, and is that achievable in today's system? And then the other comment was on Social Security. I'm a layperson, not an economist or an actuary or even a policymaker or anything. But from what I don't understand the doom and gloom so much about Social Security, and I find that, and there might be easy answers to this, that a couple of factors are left out. One is that this annual cost on the burden on the people who are working, that money, I mean, this is a facile observation, but it's true, the money goes immediately back into the economy. And it goes to fund, doesn't vanish. The second point is that the dollar economy and the U.S. economy is not limited to the U.S., and there are always going to be lots of workers overseas to produce the goods and services, well, maybe not the services that Americans need going forward. And also it's a source of enforced savings that people will need later on, because they're going to need higher guaranteed benefits rather than the reduced benefits. So anyway, with that comment and just my question for...
Just a couple comments. Thank you, Kerry. First off, annuities and insurance products can be decomposed. The kind of product that you're talking about with a guarantee can really be decomposed into an insurance component and a separate guarantee component. Really, those prices are very high, and that's just a really bad way to provide insurance. My S&P 500 fund charges me 9 basis points, and I've written about tontines, but you could avoid insurance guarantees. I don't need a 5-year guarantee when I get an annuity. I shouldn't be buying that. Insurance companies like to sell it because that's how they get people to buy it. But that sort of takes it out of being an annuity and puts it back into just being a bad investment. That 50 basis points is way too high of a fee, plus the kind of money that they'll be taking. So if I can earn 5% on my investments, but then there are fees that take away 50 basis points. Now I've really only earned 4.5%. There's just less money available for the lifetime benefits. So I'm always concerned about that. And any analysis of any insurance product should break out the insurance piece from the just pure investment piece and the cost of the investment. On the Social Security issue, there's a lot of big issues here about intergenerational justice. I mean, I guess the problem that I have with the U.S. economy right now is things are going pretty well, but Donald Trump, for example, increased the deficit by the public debt by $4.7 trillion since he came into office, and we're in a pretty good economy. And of course, he's jazzing it up so that he can get reelected, I suppose. But in good times, when George Bush had some good times, he had surpluses left to him by Clinton, and he decided, oh, well, we can do a tax cut. We can have a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq, and also, what the heck, let's give Kennedy his Medicare Part D, and that'll get me reelected. So, and we're not doing anything about the environment, we're not doing anything about infrastructure, so there's a lot of issues there. Now, in terms of intergenerational justice, it can make sense that we borrow against the future, right? I mean, I'm a professor, I'm a school teacher, I am educating people in the future. Maybe it makes sense to borrow money to pay for my pension or to pay for my benefits because I'm leaving something after me. Future generations will, in general, be wealthier than us, just as I'm wealthier than my parents. So it's not exactly clear that you have to have balanced budgets or no deficits, but I'm not sure where that line is on Social Security. If we have to pay our money to other producers in other parts of the world, yes, products will be created, but Americans will have a decline in their annual life, in their annual living standard.
Okay, we've run out of time for the session. I'd like to thank our speakers. How about another round for our speakers?